Welcome to each of you. Glad you could come to this Colloquium event. We have two very special guests here tonight, so you are the wise ones who chose to come to this Colloquium. This is Dr. Paul Patton, and I first became acquainted with his name and with him at Spring Arbor University in Michigan. I was actually here, but going to school online, and have a book with his name on it that's been in my office for years. I brought it down so he could see it. And this is Dr. Robert Woods, also one of my professors at Spring Arbor University when I was working on my master's degree. Both of these gentlemen are very accomplished. Dr. Woods has authored over 12 books in the communication field, and also is the former president of the Religious Communication Association. And I actually saw you in that context once at the National Convention, which was really fun. And then he also is the executive director of an organization that he's very passionate about, which you can see right over here on the banner, the Christianity and Communication Studies Network. And taught for over 20 years and still doing some teaching in the area. And then Dr. Patton has his background in theater arts, being very interested in bringing together the themes of Christianity with the creative arts in the theater, and has authored a number of plays, in fact, over 30 produced plays, radio programs, and performance essays. So I'm just delighted that we have these two gentlemen here tonight. It's a privilege to have them on our campus. And they've together recently authored a book that you see over here called Everyday Sabbath, and it's the subtitle that's really important: How to Lead Your Dance with Media and Technology in Mindful and Sacred Ways. And this is a theme that's really close to my own studies and my own heart and my own experience. So I'm just thrilled with this book, planning to incorporate it in courses that I teach. And again, delighted that these gentlemen are here. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here. Great to meet you all. Honored to be here. Wonderful campus. We have some students who were very gracious and helped us find the building and all of that. The book is a response that I can trace from journal entries since 1989. Okay? One of the first scenarios. I'm a young pastor. I got a sermon to finish. It's Saturday. But there's 2 football games on. Sermon, finish the sermon. Football game. Football game. And again, sometimes that's the redemptive choice. But I can trace this since 1989, when I'm saying, why is it that I have no consistent power to say no to the tsunami of invitations to take me away from my work? And sometimes the television and the football game was redemptive. We are made to have Sabbaths periodically, but they're not mindless. And oftentimes, too oftentimes, and my wife and I had started a theater in 1981. It was an experience called Trinity House Theater. You can look it up online. It's still going. We're about to experience our 40th, anniversary. How cool is that, right? It's now mainly a music venue. But it was, at the time, in 1981, an experiment in the arts. What did it mean to call Jesus Lord of the arts? I didn't even know where to begin. But I was working with people in that church who, I do the traditional thing. Let's be disciples of Christ. Let's grow as disciples. So, okay, we're going to meet to be dependent, reporting, accountable to one another. You're going to do, the weekly lesson. You're going to learn the verse. We're going to do all those Wesleyan things. And the people that could follow through on the commitment for the year weekly meeting were the people that least needed it. They were already disciplined. The majority of the people I was working with, and they had a weird pastor, a third-degree zooming pastor. But the people I wanted to work with dropped out after 2 or 3 weeks for a variety of reasons. I was part of a pop rock band, and I didn't realize at the time, but I was an actor. And we wrote a musical, a folk music artist named Jan Christ. She sold a lot of records. She's wonderful. She was in our band, and we wrote a musical together called Gravity before we opened a theater. And it was the first time I had an opportunity to see what happens to people. What happens, even if they don't call themselves artists, who are part of a project that takes 6 to 8 weeks to opening night. And I saw people transformed as they learned about how to treat each other, as informed by the fruit of the Spirit, as the Apostle Paul describes in Galatians chapter 5. What happens to a band of people when they can see specifically if they choose not to be patient, if they choose not to be agape loving, if they choose not to be forgiving, it is going to hinder the process. And I said, this is what I want to experiment with as a pastor, though I had no training at the time. My training was as a counselor, religious educator. Well, let's start a theater in 1981. I started writing for that theater. I'd never written a play before, except that musical. That went quite well. We had no auditions. Why? Because the people I was working with were too fragile to audition and fail. You want to be in a play? You're in a play. I'm going to write you a part. And we saw consistently, year after year, transformations like I have never seen before in the ministry. Now, suddenly artists started coming to the performing artists and writing artists because we were doing experiments. We'd have a quarterly performance series called The Common Room. You should try it here. You can only be involved in the performance series if you have something new. A new song, if you're a songwriter. A new hairdo. If you're a juggler, a new juggling act, it has to be new. For the playwrights that I was working with, as the years progressed, you start with a character idea, and you give us a minute monologue. If the audience likes it, you bring that character back for 3 to 5 minutes, or maybe combine them with another character. Plays were written from that. One of the characters I developed was a songwriter, country western singer named Sunset Stevie. He never smiled. One of the characters also we developed was a woman named Hurricane Velma. Hurricane and Sunset Stevie were married, and then they weren't. And every time we sang together, it had to be new, but Hurricane and Sunset would get in a fight and she'd storm off. The audience, through the years, got used to that bit. When's she going to storm off this time? But what happened was we discovered if you say to a community, you can be part of this performance act, even if you fail, even if it doesn't work. What we found is that the congregation, the community, and you didn't have to be a Christian to be involved, but the organization was going to be run by elders and people who would pray over you. We saw conversions. But what happened to a community is they realized, I can take the risk of being creative because there's a performance space that will take new art and new offerings seriously. What happened? In 1993, 12 years into the theater, we'd already hired another artistic director, and by that time, he wanted to have auditions. And so I said, okay. And we developed enough people who had had enough experience to be able to do that. I then wanted to get some more training in theater. Right? Went to Regent. I'd sat under the feet, and I'd met him at an organization called Christians in Theater Arts, which is a national network organization. A guy named Gillette Elgren. I don't know if you've ever met Gillette. I met him at one of the conferences. I said, I want to sit at his feet and learn about playwriting, learn more about theater. That happened in 1993. Now suddenly, I was no longer getting paid for writing sermons. Some of them strictly, at best, B-. Maybe 3 or 4 amens that I paid people to say. Just kidding. What frightened me is this. And this is probably what started some of the chords in 1989. I'm no longer getting paid for writing sermons. I want to stay involved in the text of Scripture. So in 1993, I decided I would memorize a verse a day. And that habit continues. Okay? And one of my main thrusts with artists and people who don't consider themselves artists, whatever the major, what do you want to remember? And how do you make sure you're remembering it? Because the habit of Christians, the habit of the culture in general, is we forget what we should remember and remember what we should forget. That's what this book is about. One of the major aspects is how to cultivate. Well, I should say this at this point. The tsunami that is distractions away from sometimes our duty, sometimes Sabbath, sometimes relationships, redemptive engagement, being conscious of the sacred now. And Abraham Joshua Hester, one of my heroes, said this: something sacred is at stake in every moment. Every moment. By the way, how can I retrieve that? Because when I read it, I went, whoa! And I put it in my journal to memorize one phrase at a time. But I've been doing this again since 1993. And it took me a few years to realize I had to review them, what I'd memorized. Or you lose it. And so now, the first thing I do in the morning, generally, the first 2 hours is on a weekly scale, weekly cycle, reviewing scriptures that I've memorized since 1993. I'm 68. My memory has never been better. I'm working with an 80-year-old guy who says, I'm a little afraid I'm losing my memory. Okay, let's stick with this program. It's in the book. What do you want to remember? What do you want to forget? How do we practice that? How do you redeem the time with that? We offer 3 antidotes, shall we say, in the book. For this storm, this tsunami that is the distraction of mass media and technology that surrounds us. Number 1, sacred intentionality. How do we cultivate making decisions even about entertainment in light of the Lordship of Christ? Taking that seriously. He does want us to rest. He does want us to enjoy the blessedness of a great film, a great television show, a great play, a great conversation. The second is what I'm going to talk about mostly tonight. Cultivating sacred interiority. An inner self that doesn't have to say much at all. What do I think about when there's nothing to think about? What do you think about when there's nothing to think about? That's when we're most vulnerable to distraction tsunamis and to binges. And I ask this question of audiences all the time about binges. When has binges ever been healthy within any context in world history? Binges. And how oftentimes we have self-justification for binge watching the 3 football games like I talked about. because it was better than what was, three-dimensionally accessible. The last one we talk about in the book is sacred identity in light of the cult of celebrity. The cult of celebrity is one of the most damnable realities of this culture because it has this habit of dwarfing us and making us unsettled. And we become better purchasers when we're unsettled about what we look like, when we can't compare ourselves to what's glistening on the screen. Gag me with a spoon. I'll teach you to say. Yeah.
In sacred identity in light of the Sundance celebrity.
Oh, in light of the cult of celebrity. Yeah. But tonight what I want to do is ask you, the first thing I'm going to ask you in terms of building a sacred interiority, what do you want to remember? And the first way I've learned how to frame this is by giving you a Jewish gift. It's one of the the great confirmations of Yahweh's promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. And again, whenever you hear the word Abraham, the patriarch, think 2000 BC, right? So 4,000 years ago. God promised to Abraham, through your seed, the world will be blessed. Now, of course, we know that ultimately that means Jesus would be a descendant of Abraham. But there are so many other graces, regardless of how your position on the Palestine question in the Middle East. Here's another one that we, as communication people, rarely think about. They gave us the gift of Shema. And I'm going to ask you, what's your Shema? What's your Shema? What is worth saying 2 to 7 times a day, like they would say, to help contextualize who you are, where you are, and why you are? It's the hub of your cognitive wheel. The most famous Shema. And of course, Jesus knew the Shema. Jesus knew the whole Pentateuch. Why? Because he was a very non-traditionally trained rabbi. The rabbi of rabbis. And they knew the Pentateuch. They knew all 50 chapters of Genesis, all 40 chapters of Exodus, and so on. They knew all 150 psalms because they sang those psalms. But here's the most famous. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, and strength. These commands ought to be written on the tablet of your heart. That's a metaphor, I think, for memorization. Impress them upon your children. Talk about them while you're sitting at home and walking along the road, while you're lying down, while you're getting up. Tie them as symbols upon your heads and bind them upon your foreheads. Write them on the doorpost of your houses and upon your gates. They said that before they got their device, and it was the last thing they said at night. What's your Shema? It should be ideally something that moves you, that can be an ultimate contextualizer for, again, who you are, where you are, why you are. It can even contextualize any temptation. For people who are married, I say, look at the first experiment in the Shema is your vows. I trained counselor, and I worked a lot with marriages that were in trouble, and I would always ask them, what did you promise? And they'd give me vagaries. I work sometimes with secular organizations, and they have mission statements. I say, your mission statement is dead on a page unless it's memorized. What do I mean? Unless you can retrieve it on command when circumstances invite you to redeem it and be contextualized by it. What's your Shema? It doesn't have to be like the Jewish Shema for life. It can be for this semester. What verse, what promise, what proclamation is worth saying to help contextualize who you are, where you are, why you are? If you can, that's the major challenge And by the way, a lot of departments have mission statements. One of the first things that I think freshmen should do is memorize the mission statement for that reason, so that they can practice contextualizing who they are, where they are, why they are, in terms of, even as a professor might give them an assignment, how does this relate to the mission? You're practicing that. What's your Shema? I say every day. And I got a long Shema. I'll just give you some of the examples. But for me, it was something that was contextualizing. Again, a hub of your cognitive wheel. A confession from Francis de Sales, who died in 1622, who was a friend of the French palatial court. And then the king that he knew and served was killed, and the Bourbons took over in 1610. And by the way, how did I know these dates? Because I read this, I want to remember the story. And I love Francis de Sales. And there's certain things I want to remember. And this one fits so well in the 21st century. He said this: don't sow your desire in somebody else's garden. Just cultivate your own as best you can. Don't long to be other than where you are. Be devoted to being thoroughly who you are. And to bearing the crosses, both small and great, you find there in your garden. So many of our celebrity longings are tied to wanting to be someone else. Be somewhere else. De Sales is saying, be the best that you can be in the garden where that is called your life. And again, what happened is I read that quote and I went, whoa! I call it the whoa factor. What do you do with it? I put it in the back of my journal to memorize one at a time. Because I want to be able to retrieve it on command as circumstances invite me to redeem it. Here's another one. Though I may be wrong, I'm willing to bet my life on the assumption that the world is not idiotic, nor run by an absentee landlord, but that this very day, some stroke is being added to the cosmic canvas, which in due time I will recognize with great joy as a stroke added by the architect who calls himself the Alpha and the Omega. The great esthetician Clyde Kilby said that. And when I read it, I went, whoa, whoa! It's the wowzer factor. Be alert when something moves you, when something inspires you. You get it down and you say, look, that's worth being able to retrieve on command as circumstances invite me. I make my comm theory students memorize the structure of their favorite 5 theories, so they can retrieve them, not for a test in a sterile environment, so that they can retrieve it 20 years from now and still use it to provide context for the decision that's before them. What do you want to remember 20 years from now? What do you want to remember? Okay. What's your Shema? I'm going to give you maybe a minute, 30 seconds to start thinking, where would you go? What would you think? Have you made, by the way, does your church have a doctrinal statement? I tell pastors all the time, if you don't know your doctrinal statement, if you can't retrieve it on command, it's dead on the page. I had a student who memorized the Apostles' Creed. We had a memorization club. And every week, we'd say, okay, what do you want to memorize this week? And it was an accountability structure. So that if they failed, no one's going to go, shame, shame, shame. But we're trying to encourage each other with remembering what we should remember and forgetting what we should forget. It's a program, you'll see it in the book, called Stewarding the Stirrings of the Soul. Stewarding, you can get that down. Stewarding the stirrings of the soul. Nice accidental alliteration. It starts with this. Sometime, probably near the end of your day, get in the habit of asking, what inspired me today? Was it something that I read in the scriptures? Whoa. Was it a statistic that inspired me? Almost a generation ago, I remember hearing that the United States of America had 7% of the world's population, 42% of the world's wealth. I went, whoa! Again, I found myself in that wowzer moment. Some statistics are so startling, they can move you. That's a hint. That's worth remembering. Stewarding the stirrings of the soul. One of the things that's the benefit of this, in my view, is it keeps you existentially alive. I didn't just get pushed around. I'm responding, even as an audience member, to a line from my favorite television show that I loved that made me laugh. I don't want to forget that. It was so wonderful. From a book, from a quote, from a professor, from a hero, from the Bible. I'll give you another example of a Shema. Lamentations. Have you ever read it? I'm sure you have. Traditionally assigned to the prophet called the weeping prophet, Jeremiah. And you want to talk about banging your head against the wall and finding that the blood on the walls on just the walls? He was ministering for a generation to an audience that refused to listen. And one of the price tags of prophetic artistry, and one of the price tags sometimes of artistry, and being a strategic communicator and trying to solve problems as you get exhausted emotionally, and that's a trigger towards depression. You got to take it seriously. But Jeremiah was one depressed cat called the weeping prophet. And this is what he says from Lamentations chapter 3, verses 17 to 23. I've been robbed of peace. By the way, have me come back sometime to talk about theatrical hermeneutics, how to bring the Bible, even in your private reading, alive. I've been robbed of peace. I've forgotten what prosperity is. I've lost my splendor and all that I'd hoped for in the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. You think you're depressed sometimes. He's weeping. Like Elijah, he was immobilizingly depressed sometimes. It's the price tag sometimes of caring and knowing that faithfulness matters. You know what he says next? But this I call to mind. You can just see him, tears in his eyes, jaws shaking. He's just shaking. But this I call to mind so that I have hope. And by the way, what is hope? In that context. And by the way, I tell my students and audiences, whenever you find a line definition, a single line definition of a significant category in life like hope, memorize it so that you can retrieve it on command as circumstances invite you to redeem it, and you'll use it 1,000 times. What is hope? Fundamentally, functionally for me, the purpose behind persistence. It's the purpose behind persistence. You can memorize that today. And why is hope so significant? It's the first thing you got to reconstruct when a couple is broken. You got to reconstruct hope, the purpose behind persistence. But this I call to mind, the weeping prophet said, so that I have hope. It is because of the Lord's loving kindness that we are not consumed. His mercies, they fail not. What's the next phrase? We sing it all the time. Great is thy faithfulness. Next time you sing it, remember, it was retrieved as a kind of Shema by a very depressed cat. Wow. When I saw that, when I was reading Lamentations, when I'm working with the depressed, I thought, that's worth memorizing. I want to remember that. Building my sacred interiority. My favorite portion of the day, almost. And again, something sacred is at stake in every moment. Right? Abraham Joshua Heschel said this also: inspiration passes, having been inspired never passes. In other words, if you can retrieve something that inspired you on command as circumstances invite you to contextualize it and redeem it, you got an oasis of the mind whenever you need it. An oasis of the mind whenever you need it. Who are your heroes? Find what they're saying that inspires you, the scenes that inspire you. Be able to retrieve them. Practice retrieving them. What moves you? I'm going to give you another couple of examples of the importance of stewarding the stirrings of the soul, particularly in an age, I call it the arrogance of literacy, which says to you, you don't have to memorize anything. You can just barely look it up. Well, it's always 7 seconds too late. I'm not saying don't read. I'm not saying I'm disappointed in the Gutenberg press. I'm thankful for it. I'm so glad I have access to books. But there's certain things, certain outlines I don't want to forget. Two examples, then I'll take some questions about cultivating sacred interiority and how do you start. And by the way, anytime you need somebody to help coach you, don't hesitate to email me. I love doing that. The first example is Jesus in the wilderness. And again, he was a smart guy. Oh yeah. But you'll read this in Luke 4, Matthew 4. He's tempted by Satan. He's been in the wilderness hungry. Mark chapter 1 describes it this way. Oh, I'm so sorry. Mark chapter 1 describes it this way. He was in the wilderness for 40 days with Satan. Angels attended him. And as you know from Matthew 4 and Luke 4, the first temptation, Satan, who knows who Jesus is prehistorically. I know you're hungry. I know your ability. Turn these rocks into bread. Jesus, you can imagine. I know that verse is somewhere. Where is it? I learned it on a flannelgraph in the program in 3rd grade. He's saying, no. And he says this. Retrieving Deuteronomy 8, chapter 8, verse 3, on command. Man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word which proceeds out of the mouth of God. And then the next two temptations, he retrieves Deuteronomy 6:13, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. By the way, any filmmakers or television producers here interested? How would you stage that scene? Get used to, when you're reading the scripture, how you would stage scenes. I could give you example after example, but we don't have that much time. That's what will bring it to life. Then the last temptation, and the last two are in different orders in both Luke and Matthew. Satan quotes Psalm 91, verses 9 through 12. Right? Which is to tell you that this is not automatically a sanctified process. People can use the Bible to manipulate others and to glorify themselves. I know more Bible verses than you do. I know more history than you do. That's always a gag me with a spoon arrogant moment. Right? What's the other example I want to give you? And again, Jesus is retrieving these things on command. The Apostle Peter, you have more education, clearly, than the Apostle Peter did. Now, obviously, he had the advantage of hanging out with Jesus for 3 years and learning from the master. But we read Acts 2, and it's about a 7 to 8 minute sermon. I could do it for you. You'd say, wow, I wish my preacher was that short. But he has no preparations. There's no notes. He's not reading. He's responding to an extemporaneous reality. The thousands of people will hear this huge explosion of the Spirit who's come in flames of fire. And he gives a 7-minute sermon that changes the world. And in that sermon, again, no notes. He has it here. He quotes portions of Joel 2, portions of Psalm 16, portions of Psalm 110. And 3,000 people said, sign me up. And oh, by the way, I will tell you about Peter. 8 chapters later, you realize he had another conversion ready to happen. Because he thought Pentecost was only for people who were circumcised, who were Jews. And then he has that Cornelius experience, and his jaw drops as he sees the same thing happening with these God-fearing Gentiles. Bring this to life by having his jaw drop. Now I realize that God does not show favoritism, but accepts men from every nation who fear him and do what is right. That's how freaked out he was by that. And when we read it in our monotone, we don't get its power. We don't realize that he'd had a subsequent conversion, if you will. So, I'm not sure where I am in the time. But let's ask me some questions, if you have any.
We probably have about
15 more minutes? Okay, cool. Should we just, I can keep going. Or do you want to have some questions right now? What do you want to do?
you guys.
Liam? Okay, I can keep going. Let me give you some more of my shamas. Okay? Because the quasi-voyeuristic revelation, semi-personal conversations, all on sites where I love to waste my time, attract me more than they should. Because the nihilistic nothingness of hyper-consumerism, which threatens to overwhelm our culture, should be fought. Because Jesus Christ still reigns, and in his love, all goodness, truth, beauty, and holiness still last. Because in the end, and at some level he's responding to Albert Camus here, because in the end there is something. That's the first quote of my Shema every day. Because I need it, because, as Nietzsche said, if a person has a why for their existence, they can face almost any how. Right? Do you have a why for your existence? It's succinctly articulated in your Shema. But that was Nietzsche, the father of the Death of God movement. Right? And by the way, a great play would be conversations and yelling matches between Nietzsche and his father, Lutheran minister father, that we never thought about. If a person has a why for existence, they can face almost any how. Why are you here? Why did you wake up? Why do you eat? Hopefully in a redemptively healthy way. Your Shema should be able to help you. I'll do some last words of saints. Okay. And what they do, why I memorize them. And again, trying to memorize, and right now it's probably about an average of every other day. But I have to review them. But I'd like to share you some stories from church history. You want to know how little we know about church history? I do this test all the time with students, all the time with adults. And I'll get it to you. It's just blank sheets, blank lines. At the end of the line is a centuries. 1 to 100 would be first century, right? 101 to 200, second century. All the way to the 21st century. And I say to my students, I say to audiences, place, you have to know for sure that a person lived in that century. How many centuries can you fill in with at least one person who lived in that century? I even have history majors that have 1,000 years. 1,000 years since Christ with blank sheets, blank lines. They're studying for a test, but not the real test. Second century, Ignatius of Antioch. Antioch was the third or fourth largest city in the Roman Empire. Christians were under attack. It was about 108, 110 AD. They're parading Ignatius of Antioch across the Roman Empire, knowing that where he's headed is his own death. They're giving him every opportunity to deny his faith. In fact, one of his subsequent, shall we say, disciples, Polycarp of Smyrna, saw him on that journey and was profoundly inspired. Ignatius of Antioch, these were not his last words, but this is in his book, and it's most inspiring. And again, when I came across that, I went, whoa! I want to know that. Why? So that it can contextualize my own pressures. This is what he wrote. Let me be fodder for the wild beasts. This is how I may get to God, for I am God's wheat being ground by the teeth of the wild beasts, that I may be the pure loaf of God. So bring on my death, but bring me to Jesus. He was thrown to the beast in the Colloquium. Church history tells us that within just 5 minutes his body was completely gone. And the Roman Empire had never seen such bravery, such courage. He knew that to be absent from the body was to be present with whom? The Lord. (155), one generation later. One generation later. You want heroes? Read church history. Memorize, master their story, and watch even third graders. No, that might be a little bit too young for them, but middle schoolers can hear this. Polycarp of Smyrna. These were his last words. And how do we know they were his last words? Can't be 100% sure, but generally what happened in this period is the people that were the executors or saw him executed were so flipped out, they started their journey towards Jesus, and they wrote down what he had shouted. And this is what Polycarp of Smyrna shouted. And again, inspired by Ignatius. For 86 years I have served him, and he's done me nothing but good. How could I blaspheme the king who saved me? The fire you threaten me with burns but an hour and is quenched after a little, but you have no fear of the eternal fire. So, why are you delaying? Come, do what you will. And then they torched him. Can you see why I decided, okay, that's worth time to try to be able to retrieve when I need it? What did you find today? Start being alert. I want to steward the stirrings of my soul. And by the way, if you're going to start with a verse a week, by the way, with any memorization program, building your sacred interiority, it's going to take you time, like with any new habit, to figure out your pace. I have one friend who memorizes one verse a month. That not what anyone tells her to memorize, but she's inspired to memorize. She's been doing it for 6 years, and she says those over 70 verses every day. Every day. So that she's razor sharp and she can retrieve them on command, again, as circumstances invite her to redeem it. I have, for instance, the same principle. I have playwriting students. If they don't master what makes for good narrative structure, then they can't be their own critic. Now, they have to wine and dine their critics. People who are going to say, look at this is the page as I read it, where it stopped being interesting. I got bored. But where they have to start is mastering, being able to retrieve for themselves narrative structure. I'm going to give you another martyr. Boniface. We have a couple of Germans here. His ministry to the northern Germanic tribes, the famous confrontation with the worshippers of Thor. He's led to the oak where Thor evidently resides. Anyone know what he did? We don't know what he said, we know what he did. Give me an axe. Inspired by Elijah. Remember that Mount Carmel story? And he goes, boom! Church history tells us the oak tree. Thousands of peoples converted. Okay. My guess is he was a little depressed after it too. Remember Elijah? This is how Boniface, the same missionary who was commissioned by the Pope to return to the people he had ministered to. He's worshiping, he's the pastor, the bishop, if you will. A lot of new converts are there, and as happens in church history, people who were making money off of the sale of idols, they were threatened. Their socioeconomic status and security was threatened. So they got a bunch of people in their gang, and they surrounded they came in with axes, clubs, torches. While these people were worshiping, they surrounded them. This is in the middle of the 8th century. They say to everyone, we'll give you an opportunity to deny Christ and come back to the worship of your idols. But if you don't, we're going to kill you all. The pastor got up, Boniface, and said, this now is the very day we've been praying for. The moment of freedom we've been yearning for is now here. So be heroic in the Lord and suffer his royal grace suffer this royal grace gladly. Keep your hope in the Lord and let him set your soul free. And then everybody was killed. How do we know what he said? Some of them that were doing the killing were so freaked out by the courage of these people that they wrote it down. Is that worth memorizing? Why was it worth memorizing for me? Because I do a show where I do a story from every century of church history. It's related to the exercise I just told you about. There are a lot of heroes there. There are a lot of stories there. There are a lot of plays to write about these wondrous things. But how do you get to the place where you can dwell on it when you want to? What's worth memorizing? What's worth retrieving? Another little hint for me as it relates to history and the church is this. The calendar date, it's the 18th today. So I'm thinking about events in history and church history of the 18th century. John Locke died in 1704. It's worth knowing. Isaac Newton died in 1727, and I would fail history when it was somebody else's syllabus. What inspires you? What's worth remembering? I don't want to forget. Okay. May I have you ask any question? I hope you were motivated a little bit. Anybody have a question? And it's okay if you don't. Because I've been thinking about this for a long time. You know how sometimes teachers will spring it on you. You know, they've been thinking about, preachers will be thinking about something and they spring it on the congregation. And yeah, Brooke.
I have a question about the specific definition for Shema. Because you defined it as a contextualizer for who you are, what you are, and why you are.
Yeah, okay. It is the Hebrew word for hear, O Israel.
Okay.
It's the Hebrew word for hear. Great clarification. Thank you, Brooke. $50 and a chance to appear next week's show, and you asked a great question. Yeah.
Free book.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone else? By the way,
So, just a question about the book. You said that there are 3, and you really dealt with
I just dealt with the second one, sacred
Yes.
interior.
The other 2 again?
Our sacred intentionality. How do you cultivate the discipline and the will to make decisions even about mass media and entertainment options, all the way from brilliant classics that are wondrously redemptive to pornographic trash?
Mm-hmm.
How do you make decisions in light of the tsunami of distractions that are coming at you, that are wanting to sell you something?
And the third one?
And the third one is sacred identity in light of the cult of celebrity. I was a high school counselor. And what was my busiest time? Valentine's week. Those people that didn't get the 37 carnations. And they felt ignored.
Yeah.
Right?
So in the book, I already know the answer to this question. Because I've read the book, but we'll find some really practical, tips for what you've been dealing with here and the other 2.
No
Yes.
question, no question. In fact, at the end of each chapter, there are questions that you can carry on, and let's get practical. That was a Robert Wood's idea, and he's a wonderful co-writer and a wonderful friend. Wow.
And a really tough teacher.
Oh, yeah, great teacher. Yeah,
In the
great
best
teacher.
way.
Yeah, exactly. But there's a whole let's get practical. And one of the first things we invite readers to do is start what we call a pop culture journal. And start for 2 weeks monitoring and moderating how much time you're spending in front of your screen. Because I taught a course called Intro to Pop Culture at Spring Arbor. And all of these exercises were a part of it. Because I wanted people to think, especially if they were believers, that pop culture is a servant, not a master. Okay? Your technology is a servant, not a master. Entertainment is understood within the context of Sabbath. We're made to find rest, right? And so we invite people to start monitoring how much time they're spending. And by the way, most of my students came out of it in a redemptive way, saying, I have some level of addiction. I know it. And one of the manifestations of it was that I had them guess before they did the work. They were always guessing, like an alcoholic or drug addict, when you're trying to help them overcome it. They minimize. You always ask, well, how much money are you spending? What's this costing you? And their self-justification system, and by the way, the prophets always confronted self-justification systems of empires and emperors. That's why they were all killed, basically. Okay? But all of my students would minimize in their guesses how much time they were really spending looking, scrolling. Right? Mm-hmm. So those exercises are there. Starting to monitor and moderate how much time you're spending, how much money you're spending. What are the price tags, that kind of thing. We also have early on in a chapter is how to identify what are the three motivations behind our entertainment lusts. Right? Mm-hmm. Entertainment longings. Okay? Have you ever had this? One of them is called reward viewing. I've worked hard. I should be allowed to sit in front and ignore my family and watch the second football game. I worked hard today. Very deadly relational if it's not monitored and moderated. There's another one that says, basically, I have nothing else to do, so I'll go to my screen. Resignation viewing. Mm-hmm. And if you find in your monitoring of your dance with pop culture, as we call it, the metaphor, the dance with pop culture and technology, if you find yourself saying you're going there because there's nothing else to do, then you don't have enough to do. Huh. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
I'm only looking because I know students have a lot of homework.
Oh, yeah. Cool. Yeah, let's go.
This is all really great. Anyone else have another question you want to ask? And I want to say a bit about the book. Any other questions?
No, I'm going to say something real quick.
Yes.
If you came tonight, take a book or two with you, it's free. Okay?
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you for being here. So ignore the signs up there about.
Okay, then I don't have my announcement.
And what we would like is, if possible, you would go to, even if it's, if you think it's 2 stars, but just we'd like people to go to Amazon and give us a review. We'd love that. And don't hesitate to contact me or either of us about how to help motivate you and help sustain in stewarding the stirrings of your soul. It will keep you alive spiritually. What moved me today? Let's talk about what inspired me today, what I read, what I saw, what I heard. Putting it in the back of your journal and saying, I want one inspiration at a time, master. And you have to review it. You have to review it. But so that you can be trigger ready with that. Shema. Okay? This was fun.
I'm so glad you're all getting a book because it's a life-changing content in this book.
Oh,
really, really good.
Well, blessings on you.
It'll be about really living instead of just hanging out in the culture.
Yeah. And by the way, are there any actors here? I know you have an acting minor.
We do. I don't.
If you see, but I encourage. See, acting. They are the sliver of civilization that still believes that anything's worth memorizing. But even, like I had a lead role in Equus once. And I love the play. But I can't remember any of the lines. Because I didn't review them. There are things worth reviewing every day.
Dr. Lewis, would you be willing to have a closing prayer?
Oh, yes. Yes. Oh, thank you all for having us here.
Yeah, thank you. You were delightful.
Thank you for being here.
Yes. Heavenly Father, thank you for the privilege of calling you Father. as we're being here together and worshiping you with our hearts and our minds. Bless this evening, Father. Let it be something we can redeem. Carry forward in those moments where we're bored, we're distracted, and we're not being mindful of living in the sacred, counting those precious sacred moments. Bless the students here, Father. Give them strength as they study. Multiply their time. Bless this program and this institution. Father, they're doing kingdom work. We're honored to have been part of it for just a little bit tonight. In Jesus' name we pray all these things. Amen.